October 15, 1943, Naples Harbor, Italy. Sergeant Paolo Rossini stood in the processing line, hands still trembling from 3 days of chaos since Italy's surrender. The captured Italian army cook stared at the American lieutenant's clipboard, waiting for assignment to labor detail or worse. Around him, hundreds of former allies turned enemies shuffled forward in worn uniforms, exhausted and uncertain. The American officer looked up, studied Paolo's service record, then said something that made no sense. "We need men who can cook real Italian food, not just for officers, for everyone. Our men, your men, everyone." Paolo blinked, certain he'd misunderstood the English. In 2 years cooking for fascist officers in North Africa, he'd never heard those words together. Everyone, real food, dignity. The concept seemed impossible in a world where armies fed rank, not hunger. Before we continue with this remarkable story of how food transformed enemies into allies, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. The lieutenant handed Paolo a requisition slip for the experimental mess unit being established at the harbor. The quantities listed made Paolo's breath catch: 800 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of sugar, 150 pounds of coffee, 300 pounds of meat, 120 liters of olive oil, enough to feed an Italian company for a month. The Americans expected him to use it in 3 days. As Paolo stared at those numbers, a realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Everything Mussolini had told them about American weakness and poverty had been a lie. And if that was false, what else had been propaganda all along? The Allied invasion of mainland Italy and Italy's armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, had created an unprecedented military situation. Approximately 430,000 Italian soldiers found themselves in American custody, their status transformed overnight from enemies to co-belligerents after Italy declared war on its former German allies. The shift was administrative, bureaucratic, bloodless, yet it represented one of the war's most profound transformations. Men who'd fought against the Allies now stood in American camps, uncertain whether to expect vengeance or something entirely unexpected. Captain William Torres, a quartermaster officer with the U.S. Fifth Army, recognized an opportunity that his logistics training had prepared him for. Military efficiency required feeding troops adequately, but the Italian prisoners presented something beyond mere labor. Italian military kitchens, even under severe material constraints, had maintained surprisingly high culinary standards. Torres documented this in his October 1943 report to Fifth Army headquarters. "Italian cooks achieve more with less than any Allied force I've observed. Their ability to create flavor from minimal ingredients represents a resource we cannot afford to ignore." This observation, pragmatic rather than humanitarian, would become the foundation of one of the war's most unusual cultural exchanges. For Italian prisoners like Paolo, American abundance created immediate cognitive dissonance that fractured everything they'd been taught. Under Mussolini's autarkic economic policies, Italian civilians received approximately 1,000 calories daily by 1943. Military rations, though prioritized, rarely exceeded 2,200 calories. Basic ingredients, wheat, sugar, olive oil, had become precious commodities rationed with bureaucratic severity. Coffee had disappeared entirely, replaced by chicory substitutes that tasted like burnt earth. Meat appeared once weekly if soldiers were fortunate. Paolo remembered garrison kitchens where he'd stretched single chickens across meals for 40 men, creating illusions of abundance through technique when ingredients failed. The American military's standard daily ration, by contrast, provided 3,400 calories. Fifth Army quartermaster records show that U.S. units in Italy received weekly allotments of 14 pounds of meat per man, 5 pounds of sugar, unlimited coffee, and abundant wheat flour. These weren't luxury provisions. This was standard issue for every American soldier, regardless of rank. The disparity represented more than military logistics. It demonstrated the fundamental difference between economies of scarcity and abundance, between nations running on fumes and nations powered by industrial might that could feed armies with casual generosity. Paolo, like most Italian prisoners, had expected harsh treatment based on fascist propaganda, that portrayed Americans as brutal and primitive. Instead, within hours of capture, Italian soldiers received K rations containing canned meat, powdered coffee, sugar, and chocolate, items many hadn't seen in civilian markets for years. The small brown boxes represented a material reality that contradicted 2 decades of fascist rhetoric. Some prisoners wept while eating their first American rations, not from gratitude but from the crushing realization of how thoroughly they'd been deceived about the world beyond Italy's borders. The systematic identification of culinary talent among Italian prisoners began immediately after the September armistice. American intelligence officers reviewed service records with unexpected thoroughness, identifying 4,782 men with professional cooking experience before conscription, restaurant chefs, hotel cooks, family bakery operators who'd learned their trades in kitchens across Italy's 20 regions. An additional 11,000 were classified as having substantial culinary knowledge, a category reflecting the fundamental role food preparation played in Italian male identity. This wasn't merely about cooking. This was about culture, tradition, identity preserved through the universal language of preparing food with care. Lieutenant James Peterson supervised the first experimental mess unit established near Naples in mid-October 1943. He documented the Italian cooks' reactions when American supply trucks arrived with the first delivery. They kept asking if there was a mistake in the requisition, Peterson wrote in his daily log. When we confirmed the quantities, several men became emotional. One veteran cook, a man who'd served since 1940, said it was the first time in 4 years he could prepare food without worrying about running out of ingredients before the meal was complete. The scene repeated itself as the program expanded, grown men weeping at the sight of abundant flour, sugar measured in pounds rather than grams, olive oil that flowed freely rather than being doled out by the spoonful. The formal establishment of the Italian Service Units, ISU program, in November 1943, created the administrative structure for this unprecedented experiment. War Department Directive AG 383.6 authorized conversion of Italian POW status to Italian Service Unit members, allowing them to work outside standard Geneva Convention restrictions on prisoner labor. This bureaucratic transformation enabled specialized units, with culinary teams proving among the most successful. Military historians later identified this program as the largest organized culinary exchange in modern military history, involving over 16,000 Italian cooks who would serve in American facilities across the United States and Allied-controlled territories. Initial American skepticism manifested in strict oversight that reflected distrust earned through years of combat. At Camp Florence, Arizona, where 34 Italian prisoners first took control of the camp kitchen in late November 1943, armed guards observed every step of meal preparation. Lieutenant Robert Chen documented the tension in his weekly report. The first day, our men stood back from the serving line, suspicious of food prepared by former enemies. Some made jokes about poison. By the third day, lines formed 30 minutes before meals opened. By the end of the first week, men were requesting seconds and asking when the Italians would cook again. This transformation occurred with remarkable speed across the 42 primary camps hosting Italian service units. The difference in approach became immediately apparent to anyone who'd endured standard Army mess hall fare. American military cooking emphasized calories and standardization, a system designed for maximum efficiency and minimum distinction. The food was adequate, filling, nutritionally sufficient, and almost aggressively bland. Italian military cooking, despite material shortages that would have crippled less resourceful cooks, maintained regional traditions and technical standards that elevated ingredients through technique rather than abundance. At Fort Meade, Maryland, mess reports from December 1943 noted a phenomenon that quartermaster officers struggled to quantify. Italian cooks utilize identical ingredients to standard Army kitchens, but achieve approximately 40% greater satisfaction ratings from personnel, the report stated with bureaucratic understatement. Food waste has decreased by 78%. Meal attendance increased by 31%. Morale improvements attributable to food quality exceed any other single program modification implemented this quarter. The numbers told a story that transcended nutrition. They demonstrated how food prepared with care and cultural knowledge could transform daily military life. Supply requisitions revealed the educational gap being bridged through necessity. Standard American military kitchens ordered ingredients by weight and nutritional requirements: pounds of flour, tons of potatoes, sides of beef measured in wholesale units. Italian-operated kitchens submitted requests specifying particular varieties and qualities that bewildered quartermaster staff trained in industrial efficiency rather than culinary distinction. At Camp Hale, Colorado, American supply officers encountered their first requisition for 6 varieties of dried herbs, 3 olive oil types distinguished by acidity levels, and flour specified by protein content for different applications. These requests initially created logistical confusion, but eventually educated American supply officers about ingredient quality distinctions they'd never considered relevant to military feeding operations. The first meals served by Italian cooks shattered American expectations, built on years of Americanized Italian food that bore little resemblance to authentic regional cuisine. At Camp Ellis, Illinois, the debut menu in December 1943 featured handmade pasta with ragu simmered for hours, roasted meats seasoned with rosemary foraged from nearby fields, and fresh-baked bread that filled the mess hall with aromas most soldiers had never experienced. All produced at scale for 1,500 men using standard Army ingredients, supplemented only with herbs the Italians had planted in small kitchen gardens they'd established within days of arrival. The base commander's report noted tersely, "Personnel previously avoiding mess hall now arrive early. Food waste decreased approximately 80%. Recommend program expansion." Language barriers initially complicated operations in ways that required creative solutions. Italian cooks and American mess personnel struggled to communicate about techniques, timing, temperatures. The War Department responded with surprising speed, creating specialized dictionaries of culinary terms. 5,000 copies distributed by February 1944 across camps with Italian cooking units. These handbooks paired Italian cooking terminology with American equivalents, allowing quartermaster staff to understand requests for specific preparations. The booklets became artifacts of cultural translation, preserving traditional Italian techniques in English for the first time in many cases. Kitchen operations required development of a unique hybrid vocabulary that mixed languages with practical creativity. Technical Italian terms entered American military kitchens: al dente, sofrito, ridurre, while American measurements and equipment names were adopted by Italian cooks working with industrial-scale ovens and standardized tools, unlike anything in Italian military or civilian kitchens. This linguistic fusion represented something deeper than mere translation. It was the creation of a shared professional language that allowed former enemies to collaborate in producing something that gave pleasure rather than inflicted harm. By March 1944, Italian service units operated kitchen facilities feeding approximately 250,000 personnel daily across American installations in the United States and Allied territories. The program expanded beyond pure military necessity to include specialized bakeries producing traditional Italian bread, pasta production facilities making fresh noodles daily, and preservation operations that captured seasonal ingredients for year-round use. The scale was unprecedented, a culinary operation larger than any restaurant chain, more complex than any industrial food service, all managed by former enemy prisoners who'd been transformed into valued professionals through the simple recognition of their expertise. Spring arrived at Fort Carson, Colorado, with mountain air that reminded Sergeant Marco Vincenti of the Apennines he'd left behind. He stood over a 40-gallon pot, stirring tomato sauce with the same wooden spoon he'd carried from Naples, one of the few personal possessions he'd been permitted to keep. The spoon bore his grandmother's initials carved into the handle, a connection to a culinary tradition that stretched back generations. An American private, assigned as his assistant, watched the slow, methodical stirring with obvious impatience. "The secret is time," Marco explained in careful English learned over months of daily kitchen work. "Americans cook with the clock. Italians cook with patience. The tomatoes tell you when they're ready, not the timer." The culinary transformation spread across military installations with speed that surprised program administrators. Army quartermaster records from April 1944 document the standardization of Italian cooking techniques for large-scale feeding operations, a systematic codification of methods previously passed down through apprenticeship and family tradition. A typical recipe for pasta al pomodoro began with instructions for 500 servings. Heat 12 gallons of olive oil in 4 separate kettles. Add 50 pounds of diced onions, sautéed until translucent but not browned. These recipes, maintained in military archives, showed the systematic scaling of traditional methods without compromising fundamental techniques that gave Italian cooking its distinctive character. American soldiers' exposure to authentic Italian cuisine created immediate cultural impact that would reshape American dining for generations. Before the war, Italian food in America meant primarily heavily Americanized dishes served in restaurants catering to immigrant nostalgia and American expectations. Spaghetti with meatballs the size of baseballs, pizza as thick as pie, red sauce so sweet it could pass for dessert. A survey conducted among 5,000 servicemen in 1943 found that only 8% had tasted food prepared by actual Italians before military service. By mid-1944, approximately 740,000 American personnel had regular access to Italian-operated mess facilities that served regional specialties prepared with traditional techniques. Private Joseph Miller from Iowa wrote home in May 1944, with the enthusiasm of someone discovering an entirely new sensory world. The Italian cooks make pasta fresh every day, nothing like the canned spaghetti we had back home. They layer flavors I never knew existed. Yesterday they made something called ossobuco that Maria, the owner of the Italian place on 5th Street in Des Moines, would never recognize. This is what Italian food actually is, and now I understand why they take such pride in their cooking. Letters like Miller's, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of servicemen, created demand that would transform American restaurant culture in the post-war years. Statistical evidence of the program's success appeared in multiple military assessments that tried to quantify something inherently qualitative. Food waste, a significant military logistics concern when supplies had to be shipped across oceans, decreased by 34.2% in Italian-operated facilities compared to standard operations. Meal attendance increased by 28.7%. Soldiers actually wanted to eat rather than viewing mess hall as an unavoidable obligation. Morale surveys conducted by the Quartermaster Corps showed 92.3% approval ratings for Italian cooking programs, compared to 56.7% for standard mess operations. The numbers demonstrated what couldn't quite be captured in statistics, that food prepared with skill and cultural knowledge nourished more than bodies. The scale of production demonstrated remarkable efficiency that impressed American officers trained in industrial management. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, Italian bakers produced 12,000 loaves of bread daily, using traditional long fermentation methods that required planning, timing, and attention impossible to automate. Fort Dix, New Jersey, saw production of 600 pounds of fresh pasta daily, all made by hand using techniques passed down through generations. These operations required significant adaptation of Italian methods for American equipment and scale, creating a hybrid approach that maintained quality while achieving industrial volume. December 1944 brought heavy snow to Fort Hamilton, New York, transforming the base into something resembling a Christmas card. The mess hall had been transformed in ways that transcended mere decoration. White tablecloths covered long tables, handmade centerpieces featuring pine branches and red berries created festive atmosphere. Candles flickered despite regulations against open flames. The Italian cooks had worked through the night preparing traditional holiday dishes from their homeland. As American soldiers and their Italian counterparts shared this feast, boundaries between former enemies dissolved completely in the simple act of breaking bread together. Special holiday meals emerged as cultural highlights that extended the Italian cooking program beyond daily sustenance into something approaching celebration. Military records document these events with unusual detail, quartermaster officers recognizing they were witnessing something historically significant. The Christmas 1944 dinner at Fort Hamilton served 2,700 personnel with a 7-course menu that read like a love letter to Italian culinary tradition. Antipasti platters featuring house-cured meats, minestrone soup rich with vegetables and herbs, handmade ravioli filled with ricotta and spinach, roasted turkey seasoned with rosemary and garlic, vegetable contorni prepared with techniques that elevated simple ingredients, panettone bread pudding that transformed leftover Christmas bread into dessert, and Italian cookies that had taken days to prepare. The teaching component of the program formalized as demand grew among American personnel who wanted to learn these techniques for themselves. By early 1945, the War Department established culinary exchange protocols that paired American mess personnel with Italian counterparts in structured apprenticeships. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, an 8-week training program taught 120 American cooks traditional Italian techniques: pasta making, sauce construction, bread baking, flavor layering that created complexity from simple ingredients. Technical Sergeant William Cooper, who completed this program, reported with the enthusiasm of a convert, "I've been cooking Army food for 3 years. The Italians taught me that military feeding can maintain dignity and tradition despite scale constraints. This knowledge will change how I cook for the rest of my life." Impact extended beyond military boundaries into surrounding communities through civilian employees who worked on bases and encountered Italian cooking that challenged their assumptions. In Salina, Kansas, local grocers near Camp Phillips began stocking Italian ingredients to meet weekend demand from civilian workers who'd experienced authentic dishes on base and wanted to recreate them at home. The manager of Peterson's Grocery noted in February 1945 with bemused surprise, "We sold more olive oil in the past 6 months than in the previous 10 years combined. People are asking for things I can't even pronounce. The war is changing what people want to eat." September 1945 brought victory and the gradual dissolution of programs built for wartime necessity. Giuseppe Moretti stood at the ship's railing, watching the Manhattan skyline recede as his transport headed toward Italy. In his pocket, honorable discharge papers from the Italian service unit at Fort Dix. In his footlocker, American cooking equipment he'd been permitted to keep: a set of measuring cups, stainless steel whisks, and a chef's knife manufactured in Ohio. After 2 years cooking for American troops, he was returning to a homeland he barely recognized from the letters that had reached him describing devastation, hunger, chaos. The systematic repatriation process moved 12,174 Italian cooks back to Italy between August 1945 and March 1946. Men returning to a country devastated by years of war, occupation, and civil conflict. But 3,554 submitted applications to remain in the United States, drawn by economic opportunity and connections formed through years of daily collaboration with Americans. Eventually, 2,711 received permission to stay, a 22% retention rate that exceeded any other specialist category among Italian service units, reflecting both the success of the program and the opportunities it had created for men with valuable skills in a nation about to experience a restaurant boom. Italian cooks returning home encountered a devastated culinary landscape that made their years in American abundance seem like fever dreams. Civilian food rations in post-war Italy averaged 1,180 calories daily when available. Basic ingredients remained severely restricted: sugar limited to 200 grams monthly per person, olive oil to 100 milliliters weekly, meat appearing sporadically at 200 grams monthly if you were fortunate. This scarcity contrasted sharply with the abundance these men had experienced in American kitchens, creating a cognitive dissonance that some never fully resolved. They'd lived in a world of plenty while their families starved, a guilt that complicated their homecoming. The skills acquired in American kitchens proved valuable in Italy's economic recovery in ways that transcended individual success. Survey data collected by Allied occupation authorities in 1947 found that 72% of returned Italian military cooks secured employment in food service within 6 months, compared to 36% employment rate among general returning military personnel. Their exposure to large-scale operations, systematic food management, and American techniques created immediate advantages in the rebuilding hospitality sector. They became bridges between Italian tradition and American efficiency, creating a hybrid approach that would define post-war Italian restaurant culture. American servicemen returning home carried newfound appreciation for authentic Italian cuisine that would reshape American dining. Veteran surveys conducted in 1947 found that 63% of respondents listed real Italian food among experiences they wished to continue in civilian life. This demand created market opportunities that transformed American restaurant culture. The GI Bill enabled several hundred veterans to open restaurants featuring dishes they'd encountered in military mess halls operated by Italians, establishments that bore little resemblance to the red sauce joints that had previously defined Italian-American cuisine. These restaurants introduced regional specialties, authentic techniques, ingredient quality standards that educated American diners about what Italian food actually meant in Italy. June 1975 arrived hot and humid in Chicago. The bustling Italian restaurant displayed a framed photograph near the entrance, a black and white image showing its owner, Mario Ricci, in an Italian service unit uniform, standing proudly in an American military kitchen 32 years earlier. Regular customers knew the story, how Mario had been captured in North Africa, transferred to Kansas, taught Americans to make real pasta, and stayed after the war to open this restaurant that had become a neighborhood institution. The photograph represented one success among thousands that collectively transformed American understanding of Italian cuisine, a culinary revolution that began in wartime mess halls, where former enemies discovered that food could bridge divisions that military force could only deepen. The long-term impact of the Italian cooking program permeated American food culture far beyond what military planners could have anticipated. Restaurant industry statistics document this transformation with remarkable clarity. In 1940, approximately 4,700 Italian restaurants operated in the United States, predominantly serving Americanized versions that Italian immigrants wouldn't recognize. By 1970, this number had grown to 27,600 establishments, with market research showing increasing emphasis on regional authenticity and traditional techniques that the wartime generation had learned to appreciate. Italian Americans leveraged the new appreciation for authentic cuisine, using GI Bill benefits to establish food-related businesses that rode the wave of demand created by veteran customers who'd tasted the real thing in Army mess halls. Perhaps most profoundly, returned Italian cooks became unintentional ambassadors for democratic values in ways that formal diplomacy could never achieve. Giuseppe Lanza, who served at Fort Carson before returning to Sicily, told an oral historian in 1968, "In America, I was judged only by what I created with my hands. Not my rank, not my family connections, not my politics, just the food I made. This showed me another kind of society was possible, where competence mattered more than connections. That lesson shaped everything I did after returning home." This testimony, multiplied across thousands of returned cooks, contributed to Italy's post-war democratic development through the unlikely medium of shared meals and mutual respect, established in military kitchens where former enemies worked side by side. The captured Italian cooks who once stood stunned when Americans asked them to feed everyone ultimately changed both nations through their expertise. They demonstrated that food could bridge seemingly insurmountable divisions, creating understanding that formal diplomacy struggled to achieve. What began as a practical solution to feeding troops evolved into a profound cultural exchange that would nourish both nations for generations. The simple act of recognizing skill, treating former enemies with professional respect, and sharing meals prepared with care accomplished what military force alone could never achieve. Genuine reconciliation built on the universal human need for nourishment and the equally universal human capacity to appreciate food prepared with knowledge, care, and the desire to give pleasure through what hands create.